Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories, where long thoughts slow down, ancient ideas are allowed to breathe, and history is explored not as a list of answers, but as a quiet space to sit with possibilities. Tonight, we settle into a story that gently turns a familiar narrative around and looks at it from the other side, not with urgency or accusation, but with patience and care. This is not a tale of gods descending in fire or humans waiting helplessly in the dust. It is something quieter, something less comfortable, and perhaps more revealing. It is the idea that the collapse, disappearance, or retreat of the Anunnaki was not caused by cosmic disaster, divine conflict, or abandonment from the stars, but by the slow, unintended consequences of humanity itself. If this space feels calm, if the pacing helps your thoughts unwind rather than race, a simple gesture of support such as a like or a subscription allows this quiet corner to continue existing for others who may need it. This is not a demand, only an invitation that drifts by and moves on. Now, with nothing pressing to solve and nowhere else to be, the story can begin its slow unfolding. For a very long time, the Anunnaki have been framed as the ones who shaped humanity. They were the teachers, the engineers, the overseers, the figures who arrived from somewhere beyond the familiar sky and altered the course of early civilization. In tablets and fragments, in myths translated through centuries of retelling, they appear as architects of order and bringers of structure. They taught agriculture, governance, mathematics, writing, and law. They organized labor, measured land, and divided time. Humanity in this telling was the product. The Anunnaki were the cause. But history has a habit of becoming unstable when examined too closely. When a narrative remains unchanged for too long, when every action flows in one direction, it begins to feel less like memory and more like comfort. The idea that humanity was always acted upon rather than acting, that growth was granted rather than earned, and that collapse always arrived from above rather than within, is soothing in its own way. It removes responsibility. It suggests that power only ever flows downward. This story begins where that comfort quietly erodes. Imagine a world where humanity did not simply receive knowledge, but absorbed it. Not all at once, not in some dramatic awakening, but slowly, unevenly, and imperfectly. Skills were learned, copied, modified, and passed along. Mistakes were made, shortcuts were discovered, workarounds emerged. Systems originally designed for obedience began to be understood rather than merely followed. Tools stopped being mysterious objects and became familiar extensions of the hand and mind. Control, when it relies on ignorance, does not survive understanding. At first, there would have been no alarm. The early signs of independence would have looked like success. Labour became more efficient. Construction accelerated. Agriculture stabilised. Population grew. The Anunnaki, if they existed as overseers rather than omniscient gods, may have seen these developments as proof that their project was working. Humanity was becoming capable. Capable beings, however, do not remain dependent forever. The shift would not have announced itself with rebellion or violence. It would have appeared as small deviations, questions asked quietly, instructions interpreted creatively, rules bent slightly to fit local needs, knowledge shared laterally rather than vertically, authority still acknowledged, but no longer essential to daily function. Systems that once required supervision began operating on their own. This is often how control ends, not through open resistance, but through redundancy. As generations passed, human memory grew longer. Stories accumulated, techniques improved, patterns were noticed. When floods came, responses were faster. When drought arrived, storage methods softened its blow. The world became less frightening, not because it was safer, but because it was better understood. In such an environment, the presence of overseers shifts from necessity to inconvenience. The Anunnaki, if they remained, would have faced a subtle problem. Humanity no longer needed to be told what to do in order to survive. Guidance turned into suggestion, instruction became tradition, authority transformed into symbolism, and symbolism, once recognized as such, loses its force. Myths often describe gods who grow angry, distant, or punitive. These traits may not represent cruelty, but frustration. A teacher who realizes the student no longer listens does not always respond with pride. Sometimes the response is withdrawal, sometimes it is suppression, sometimes it is an attempt to rewrite the story so that dependence appears eternal even after it has ended. In this light, tales of divine punishment, floods, confusion of languages, or sudden disappearances can be read differently, not as acts of dominance, but as attempts to regain relevance. When power slips quietly away, it often lashes out in symbolic form. But humanity's role may have gone further than passive evolution. As understanding deepened, humans may have begun replicating systems once controlled exclusively by the Anunnaki. Governance without divine intermediaries, engineering without sacred oversight, knowledge transmission without priestly filters. Once these processes functioned independently, the Anunnaki were no longer central. They were optional, and optional authority rarely survives intact. At some point, coexistence may have become unstable, not because humans attacked, but because their continued growth made the old hierarchy impossible to maintain. A species capable of self-organization does not remain managed forever. Even benevolent overseers become obstacles when their presence limits expansion. The result need not have been war. Collapse can occur without battles. Withdrawal can masquerade as ascension. Silence can be framed as mystery. When those in power lose their position without catastrophic defeat, they often leave behind stories that preserve dignity. Gods do not lose control. They depart. They ascend. They return to the heavens. The narrative shifts, but the outcome remains the same. They are no longer here. What remains afterward is telling. Humanity continues. Civilization accelerates. Writing spreads. Trade expands. Technology compounds. The loss of divine presence does not halt progress. In many cases, it seems to coincide with greater independence. This does not prove responsibility, but it aligns uncomfortably well with the pattern of a system that has outgrown its creators. If humanity did play a role in the disappearance of the Anunnaki, it would not be recorded as such. History is written by survivors, but mythology is written by those who wish to be remembered a certain way. A defeated god does not describe defeat. A displaced authority does not admit irrelevance. Instead, it reshapes memory. This may explain why later traditions emphasize obedience, worship, and divine hierarchy more aggressively than earlier records. The need for worship often increases when authority weakens. The insistence on reverence grows loudest when control has already slipped. Over time, the story settles. The Anunnaki become distant ancestors rather than present figures. Their actions freeze into legend. Their absence becomes normal. Humanity fills the space they left, not with reverence, but with administration, politics, conflict, and innovation. The world continues, not because it was abandoned, but because it no longer required supervision. This is not a story of blame. It is not an accusation or a triumph. It is a quiet reorientation, a suggestion that humanity was never merely a passive creation waiting for instruction, but an evolving system capable of exceeding its original design. If the Anunnaki fell, faded, or left, it may not have been because they failed, but because their role ended. Such an ending would not feel dramatic from the inside. It would feel gradual, almost boring. One generation noticing less presence than the last. Another inheriting stories rather than encounters. Eventually belief replaces interaction. Memory replaces oversight, ritual replaces instruction, and life continues. As this thought settles, it does not demand conclusion. It opens a wider landscape instead. If humanity was responsible for the disappearance of its makers, then responsibility itself becomes an inherited trait. Power passes downward. Consequences follow. The throne, once occupied by distant figures, stands empty, not because it was destroyed, but because it was no longer needed. The story does not end here. It simply shifts its weight, moving forward into what came next, into how memory reshaped absence, and how silence became sacred. In the earlier stretch of this story, long before collapse or departure or silence, humanity existed in a state that could best be described as quiet, not because the world itself was still, but because humans had not yet learned how loudly they could speak into it. This quiet was not ignorance in the simple sense. It was not a lack of awareness or an absence of thought. It was a condition shaped by scale. Humanity was small in influence, narrow in reach, and limited in consequence. Actions mattered locally. Mistakes faded quickly. Knowledge travelled slowly and often dissolved before it could harden into systems. In such a world, power naturally rested elsewhere. If the Anunnaki were present during this time, they would not have encountered a species on the brink of rebellion or self-determination. They would have encountered something closer to raw potential. Humans were adaptive, curious, and resilient, but not yet cumulative. Each generation learned much and lost nearly as much. Progress existed, but it reset often. Memory was fragile. Infrastructure did not survive catastrophe. Authority did not outlive the individuals who embodied it. Quiet does not mean peaceful. Early human life was demanding, unstable, and frequently brutal. Survival absorbed most energy. There was little space for abstraction beyond immediate needs. Food, shelter, reproduction, and protection shaped daily existence. Thought followed function. Reflection was brief. Systems were temporary. In this environment, an external organizing force would not have been resisted. It would have been absorbed as another feature of reality, like weather or terrain. The earliest myths do not describe humans as challengers. They describe them as workers, caretakers, servants, or creations. Whether these descriptions are literal or symbolic, they point to a shared understanding that humanity did not yet see itself as central. Purpose came from outside. Direction was given. Order arrived from above or beyond. The quiet human did not argue with the structure of the world. The structure simply was. What matters here is not whether the Anunnaki existed exactly as described, but how the relationship is framed. The earliest layers of these stories rarely emphasize conflict. They emphasize instruction. The gods teach humans how to farm, how to build, how to measure, how to organize time and land. These are not the gifts given to rivals. They are the tools given to dependents. Instruction flows downward when the learner is not yet expected to innovate. During this period, humanity's silence was functional. It allowed systems to be imposed without resistance. It allowed hierarchy to stabilize. It allowed knowledge to be controlled through limited channels. When a population cannot preserve information reliably, control remains external by default. The Anunnaki, if they were present as overseers, would not have needed force. Dependency would have done the work for them. Humans learned through repetition. Tasks were performed because they worked, not because their underlying principles were understood. Ritual and habit replaced theory. This distinction is important. A being who performs a task without understanding its mechanics cannot easily alter the system that task supports. They can operate within it, but they cannot reshape it. In this sense, early humanity was quiet not because it lacked intelligence, but because it had not yet developed leverage. Leverage requires stored knowledge, coordination, and continuity. It requires the ability to build upon previous understanding rather than rediscover it repeatedly. The quiet human lived in cycles rather than trajectories. The presence of advanced overseers in such an environment would have accelerated certain developments while freezing others. Agriculture could be optimized without explaining ecological principles. Architecture could be standardized without teaching engineering theory. Governance could be imposed without cultivating political philosophy. This creates efficiency without empowerment. Efficiency is often mistaken for progress. For a time, this arrangement would have seemed ideal. The Anunnaki maintain order. Humans perform necessary functions. Civilization emerges without chaos. Surpluses increase. Populations stabilize. The world becomes predictable. From the perspective of control, this is success. From the perspective of long-term autonomy, it is delay. The quiet phase likely lasted longer than later traditions imply. Change was slow. Generations passed without dramatic shifts in worldview. Humans accepted their place because they had no framework for alternatives. Identity was collective rather than individual. Innovation occurred, but it was incremental and easily absorbed back into the system that produced it. Even curiosity, when it arose, did not yet threaten structure. Asking how to improve a tool is not the same as asking who controls its use. Early curiosity focused on immediate problems: better crops, stronger shelters, more reliable tools. These improvements benefited overseers as much as they benefited workers. There was no incentive to suppress them. In this stage, the Anunnaki would not have perceived humanity as a future risk. There would have been no reason to. A system that runs smoothly does not announce its eventual instability. The seeds of change often look like compliance at first. Silence also shaped belief. When authority is external and unquestioned, belief becomes descriptive rather than analytical. Humans did not debate the nature of their overseers. They explained them. Stories functioned as memory aids rather than challenges. Myth preserved instruction. Ritual reinforced obedience. Language encoded hierarchy. This does not require deception. It requires alignment. A society that benefits from stability will reproduce the narratives that sustain it. Early humans benefited from structure because chaos was costly. Submission, even if uncomfortable, was safer than uncertainty. The Anunnaki, if present, would have been interpreted through the lens of necessity. They were not gods because they demanded worship. They were gods because their presence coincided with survival. When floods were managed, crops improved, and cities rose, gratitude followed naturally. Gratitude hardens into reverence when alternatives are not visible. The quiet human did not imagine replacing the overseer any more than early agricultural societies imagined replacing the sun. Control appeared inseparable from the natural order. Authority was not questioned because it was not yet conceptualized as something constructed. Time, however, introduces erosion into all systems. As populations grew and settlements expanded, humans began interacting more with each other than with overseers. Shared labor created shared identity. Repetition created familiarity. Familiarity reduced awe. The overseer, once distant and overwhelming, became predictable. Predictability diminishes mystique. Language evolved to accommodate complexity. Writing emerged to preserve memory beyond individual lifespans. With writing came comparison. Records allowed humans to notice patterns not just in nature, but in governance. Instructions could be reviewed, edicts could be copied, discrepancies could be noticed. This did not immediately create dissent. It created awareness. The quiet phase began to shift when awareness accumulated faster than control could adapt. Humans did not become loud overnight. They became observant. They began to notice that systems functioned even when overseers were absent, that rituals continued to work even when the gods were silent, that cities did not collapse when divine attention moved elsewhere. These observations would not have been framed as challenges. They would have been framed as reassurance. The world did not end when direct supervision waned. This is a dangerous realization for any hierarchy. Still, the quiet human did not revolt. Not yet. The mental infrastructure required for rebellion did not exist. What existed instead was normalization. Humans grew accustomed to managing complexity. They solved problems locally. They adapted instructions to circumstance. They filled gaps without waiting. The Anunnaki, if they noticed this shift, may not have interpreted it as threat. Adaptability can be misread as loyalty. Independence can be mistaken for competence within bounds. Systems often fail because they cannot distinguish between the two. Silence persisted even as capability grew. Humans did not announce their evolution. They simply lived it. Tools improved. Trade networks expanded. Authority decentralized by necessity rather than ideology. Each step was small enough to appear harmless. This is how control systems fail without confrontation. They are outgrown. By the end of this phase, humanity was no longer purely quiet, but it had not yet found its voice. It existed in an in-between state, capable but still deferential, organized but not yet self-authorizing, intelligent but not yet reflective about power itself. The Anunnaki may have still seen themselves as essential. The rituals continued, the myths persisted, worship remained. But beneath the surface, dependency was thinning. The foundation of authority was no longer unquestioned necessity, but habit. Habit can be broken. As this period fades into the next, the tone of the story begins to change, not with conflict, but with subtle tension. Humans are no longer simply receiving knowledge. They are beginning to learn how learning itself works, and once a system understands its own mechanics, silence becomes temporary. The quiet ones were not asleep. They were listening. The role humanity occupied in the earlier systems was not that of ruler or challenger, but helper. That word matters. A helper is close enough to observe, trusted enough to participate, and limited enough to remain beneath notice. Helpers are given tasks, not authority. They are expected to follow procedures, not understand the reasons behind them. They are allowed proximity without power. For a long time, this role fit humanity well. The helpers built what they were told to build. They moved stone, dug channels, shaped land, and maintained systems that had already been designed. They followed instructions that arrived already complete. When something failed, correction came from above. When something succeeded, credit flowed upward. The structure remained intact. But helping is not a static state. It is an apprenticeship, whether intended or not. Every task performed repeatedly becomes familiar. Familiarity leads to pattern recognition. Pattern recognition leads to understanding. And understanding, once it accumulates, cannot be unlearned. The Anunnaki may have believed they were delegating labour. What they were actually doing was distributing exposure. Exposure is dangerous to hierarchies that rely on mystery. The helpers watched systems operate day after day. They saw how water moved through channels, how structures bore weight, how schedules aligned with seasons, how resources were allocated. At first, these observations remained fragmented. A worker understood one part of a process, not the whole. But fragmentation does not prevent learning. It only slows integration. Over generations, fragments began to connect. One group noticed that certain measurements always preceded construction. Another realized that harvest schedules aligned with predictable cycles. Others observed that authority relied on timing, coordination, and record-keeping as much as divine presence. None of these insights were revolutionary on their own. Together they formed something new, a distributed understanding of systems that no longer required constant oversight. This is where learning began to accelerate. Unlike the overseers, humanity learned collectively. Knowledge was not centralized in a single authority. It diffused through families, guilds, and communities. One innovation spread outward, altered by context, refined by necessity. Mistakes were made, corrected, and remembered. Each correction added resilience. The Anunnaki, if they existed as a relatively small ruling class, would have learned differently. Their knowledge was already complete by design. Their systems were established. Their learning curve was shallow. Humanity's was steep. Steep learning curves are deceptive. At first, progress appears slow, then it compounds. The helpers began to notice redundancies. Certain rituals produced no measurable outcome. Some instructions seemed ceremonial rather than functional. Others could be modified without consequence. When a rule can be bent without collapse, it stops feeling absolute. Still, none of this required rebellion. Helpers do not rebel by default. They optimize. They find easier ways to achieve the same result. They adapt instructions to local conditions. They solve problems quietly because silence is safer than challenge. In doing so, they begin to outperform the system that trained them. This is often where hierarchies fail to recognize danger. Improvement is welcomed. Efficiency is praised. Productivity increases. The helpers appear loyal. The system seems stronger than ever, but beneath the surface, dependency is eroding. When humans learned to predict outcomes rather than wait for instruction, the balance shifted. Predictive ability is power. A group that can anticipate consequences no longer needs permission to act. The Anunnaki may have responded by increasing ritual, reinforcing hierarchy, or emphasizing divine origin stories. These responses are common. When authority senses dilution, it doubles down on symbolism. It reminds followers where power is supposed to reside. But symbols are only effective while they explain reality. Once reality functions without them, they become decorations. The helpers' learning did not remain technical. It expanded into social organization. Humans began managing labor among themselves. They resolved disputes internally. They developed norms that existed alongside imposed law. Parallel systems emerged, informal but effective. Parallel systems are dangerous because they prove alternatives exist. The Anunnaki may not have intended to create these conditions, but intent matters less than outcome. By placing humans close enough to complex systems without granting full authority, they created observers who eventually understood those systems intimately. Understanding eliminates awe. Awe is the foundation of divine authority. As learning accelerated, the gap between helper and overseer narrowed. Not in raw capability, perhaps, but in functional relevance. Humans did not need to surpass their creators to destabilize the hierarchy. They only needed to become sufficient. Sufficiency is often mistaken for loyalty. At some point, the helpers would have begun teaching each other without reference to the original source. Knowledge transmission shifted from vertical to horizontal. This is a critical threshold. Once learning no longer depends on the authority that introduced it, that authority becomes optional. Optional authority cannot enforce permanence. The Anunnaki, if attentive, might have attempted to slow this process, restrict access to certain knowledge, centralize instruction, reserve advanced tools for select intermediaries. History shows similar patterns later in human societies. Priesthoods, castes, and secret knowledge emerge when control is threatened. But restriction often accelerates curiosity rather than suppressing it. Scarcity makes information valuable. Valuable information spreads. The helpers did not learn everything at once. They learned enough. Enough to maintain infrastructure. Enough to plan ahead. Enough to respond without guidance. Enough to question internally even if not aloud. The learning was uneven. Some regions advance faster than others. Some communities remain dependent longer. This unevenness would have made the overall shift harder to detect. Control did not collapse everywhere at once. It thinned gradually, inconsistently, quietly. This is why myths rarely describe a single moment of rebellion. There is no dramatic uprising in the earliest layers. Instead, there is withdrawal, distance, silence. The gods stop walking among humans. They retreat to the heavens. They become less accessible. Distance is often framed as transcendence. It is more often retreat. The helpers who learned too fast did not overthrow their overseers. They made them unnecessary. The most effective way to remove power is to outgrow it. From the perspective of the Anunnaki, this would have been destabilizing. Authority that depends on supervision struggles when supervision is no longer required. Guidance loses value when outcomes can be achieved independently. The response to such a shift is rarely graceful. Systems built on hierarchy do not dissolve themselves willingly. They resist, they obscure, they reinterpret. This may be where stories of divine displeasure, punishment, or testing originate. When control weakens, narratives intensify. Obedience becomes moralized. Compliance becomes virtue. Dissent, even silent dissent, becomes transgression. But the helper's learning had already crossed a threshold. Knowledge once distributed cannot be recalled. Skills once internalized cannot be erased without destroying the system that depends on them. Humanity had learned how to sustain itself within the structures provided. That learning was irreversible. The helpers were no longer just maintaining a system. They were becoming the system. This did not mean they were ready to rule. It meant they were ready to continue. Continuation is more powerful than domination. A ruler can be removed. A process that sustains itself cannot. As this phase progressed, the relationship between humans and their overseers changed in tone. Reverence softened into tradition. Command softened into expectation. Presence softened into memory. The gods were still acknowledged, but they were no longer central to daily function. This is often the moment when creators realize their creation has exceeded its initial constraints. The response to that realization determines the next stage of the story. What followed was not immediate collapse, but tension. A system no longer aligned with its hierarchy cannot remain static. Either control tightens or authority withdraws. Either way, the balance shifts. Humanity did not yet speak loudly. It did not declare independence. But it had learned enough to survive without constant instruction. The helpers had learned too fast for the hierarchy to remain comfortable. The silence that once defined humanity was changing. It was no longer the silence of dependency. It was the silence of capability. And capability, once achieved, does not wait forever. The shift did not begin with weapons, and it did not begin with open defiance. It began with tools. Tools are quiet things. They do not announce intention. They sit in the hand and wait to be used. They feel neutral, almost innocent. But tools carry knowledge inside them, and knowledge has a habit of changing whoever holds it long enough. In the earliest phases, tools were extensions of instruction. A tool was given with a purpose already defined. This stone is for cutting. This plough is for turning soil. This mould is for shaping metal according to a known form. Humans learned how to use these objects through repetition, not experimentation. Variation was discouraged because consistency preserved order. When tools function exactly as intended, systems remain predictable. The first line was crossed when tools stopped being used only as instructed and began to be understood. Understanding transforms a tool from an object into a possibility. At first, this understanding was practical. A farmer notices that a tool works better at a slightly different angle. A builder adjusts spacing because local stone behaves differently. A craftsperson modifies a form to reduce waste. None of these changes challenge authority directly. They improve outcomes. Improvement is rarely punished in systems that value productivity. But improvement accumulates. Every adjustment teaches something about cause and effect. Over time, humans began to internalize principles rather than procedures. They did not just know that something worked. They began to sense why it worked. This distinction matters. A procedure can be enforced. A principle can be adapted. The Anunnaki, if they were managing a large complex system, likely relied on standardized tools and methods. Standardization simplifies control. When everyone uses the same process, deviations are easier to spot. But standardization also creates a baseline. Once humans mastered that baseline, they could push beyond it. The first line was not crossed when humans used tools independently. It was crossed when they began to modify tools without guidance. Modification implies confidence. Confidence implies ownership. This process would not have been uniform. Some communities remained conservative, adhering closely to established methods. Others, driven by necessity or curiosity, experimented more freely. Environmental pressures accelerated divergence. Different soils, climates, and resources demanded adaptation. The overseers could not be everywhere at once. Local solutions emerged. Local solutions become local knowledge. Local knowledge spreads laterally. It does not require permission. It is shared because it works. When a tool is modified and produces better results, others notice. The modification is copied. Variations emerge. A family of tools evolves. This is a quiet revolution. No ideology accompanies it. No declaration is made. But something fundamental changes. Humans are no longer merely executing designs. They are participating in design itself. The line between helper and creator begins to blur. Knowledge followed tools closely. Measurement systems were internalized. Ratios were remembered. Timings were anticipated. Humans began predicting outcomes before they occurred. Prediction reduces dependence. When you know what will happen, you no longer need to ask. This is where oversight becomes uncomfortable. The Anunnaki may have tolerated modification at first. A system that improves itself appears efficient. But efficiency without control is dangerous. The moment humans could achieve results without understanding the original intent behind a system, intent itself became irrelevant. Intent is where authority hides. The line that was crossed was not technological, it was conceptual. Humans began treating systems as systems rather than gifts. Once something is seen as a system, it can be analysed, dismantled, and reassembled. Reverence gives way to function. Function can be optimized. Optimized systems do not require reverence. Tools, once sacred or restricted, became commonplace. Familiarity replaced awe. A device used daily stops feeling divine. It becomes furniture, background, infrastructure. Infrastructure is powerful precisely because it fades from awareness. As tools spread, so did the understanding that they could be combined. One tool enhanced another. Processes chained together. Output increased. Complexity rose. Humans began coordinating labour not just to complete tasks but to manage workflows. This required planning. Planning required abstraction. Abstraction required communication. Communication reshaped social structure. Those who understood systems best became informal leaders. Not because they were appointed, but because others deferred to competence. This kind of authority is subtle. It does not announce itself. It emerges through trust based on results. This form of leadership does not align neatly with imposed hierarchy. It exists parallel to it. Parallel authority is the most destabilizing kind because it does not confront. It coexists. The Anunnaki may have attempted to reassert control by restricting access to advanced tools or knowledge. Certain techniques may have been declared sacred. Some methods reserved for intermediaries. This creates bottlenecks. Bottlenecks create pressure. Pressure seeks release. Humans responded by working around restrictions rather than challenging them. Alternative tools were developed, less efficient at first but unrestricted. Over time, these alternatives improved. Independence rarely begins at peak performance. It begins at sufficiency. Sufficiency is enough. The first line that was crossed, then, was not an act of rebellion. It was the moment when humans no longer needed to fully understand why a tool was sacred in order to use it effectively. Sacredness became optional. Function remained. Once sacredness is optional, authority becomes negotiable. This shift likely went unnoticed for some time. Systems do not collapse when lines are crossed quietly. They destabilize slowly. The signs appear as minor inefficiencies in control. Instructions need repetition. Compliance requires reinforcement. Rituals feel heavier. Authority demands affirmation. These are symptoms of a system losing its automatic legitimacy. Tools continue to evolve. Humans began creating tools for purposes not explicitly defined. Specialization increased. Craft became identity. Identity reinforced autonomy. A person who defines themselves by what they make rather than who they serve thinks differently. This difference is subtle but profound. Knowledge storage expanded. Writing preserved modifications and improvements. Records outlived individuals. Knowledge began to accumulate across generations rather than resetting. Accumulated knowledge compounds faster than any single authority can manage. Compounding is irreversible. At this stage, the Anunnaki would have faced a choice, whether consciously or structurally. Adapt the hierarchy to accommodate human autonomy, or attempt to contain it. Hierarchies rarely choose adaptation when containment still appears possible. Containment often accelerates the very outcome it fears. The first line crossed did not trigger immediate consequences. There was no collapse, no sudden disappearance, but it altered the trajectory. Humanity moved from user to innovator, from executor to modifier, from dependent to partially independent. Partial independence is unstable. It demands resolution. The tools humans held now carried embedded understanding. Knowledge lived in hands and habits, not just in instruction. This made control diffuse. You cannot easily remove knowledge that has become practice. Practice is resilient. As generations passed, children learned modified methods as normal. They did not know which techniques were original and which were adapted. Authority lost historical clarity. When origin is forgotten, legitimacy weakens. The Anunnaki may have continued to present themselves as originators, but origin matters less than relevance. A system that no longer requires active input from its originator does not remain subordinate forever. The line that was crossed marked the beginning of a slow inversion. Humans were no longer merely maintaining what was given. They were shaping what came next. This did not yet threaten the existence of the overseers, but it threatened their position. And position, once threatened, reshapes behavior. What followed was not immediate conflict, but tightening. Rules became more explicit, boundaries more pronounced. The gap between what humans could do and what they were allowed to do widened. Such gaps generate tension. The tools that had once connected humans to their overseers now became instruments of separation. Each improvement reduced the need for oversight. Each innovation made authority feel less essential. The first line crossed was invisible at the time. It would only be recognized later, in hindsight, as the moment when creation began to operate on its own terms. From here, the story does not leap forward. It deepens. The tools and knowledge that empowered humanity begin to alter not just capability, but self-perception. And self-perception, once changed, reshapes everything that follows. The system had not yet broken, but it was no longer intact in the way it once had been. For a long time, obedience functioned as a kind of survival language. It was not enforced through constant threat, but through structure. To obey was to participate in a system that worked. Crops grew, cities held, seasons were anticipated. Lives, while difficult, were predictable enough to endure. Obedience did not feel like submission. It felt like alignment. In the earliest phase, curiosity existed only inside narrow boundaries. Humans asked how to perform tasks better, not why those tasks existed in the first place. Questions stayed close to the ground. How to lift this stone more efficiently, how to prevent water from escaping a channel, how to preserve food a little longer. These questions did not disturb hierarchy. They strengthened it. But curiosity has a way of widening without announcing itself. As tools were modified and knowledge accumulated, the mental posture of obedience began to change. Humans were no longer simply following instructions, they were anticipating them. Anticipation subtly rearranges authority. When you know what will be asked before it is asked, the command loses some of its weight. At first, this anticipation remained internal. A worker prepares materials before being told. A planner organizes labor ahead of schedule. An overseer sees efficiency and approves. Approval reinforces behavior. Reinforced behavior spreads. What no one announces in these moments is that the center of initiative has begun to shift. Obedience becomes curiosity not through defiance, but through confidence. When actions succeed repeatedly without correction, the fear of error diminishes. Diminished fear allows space for exploration. Exploration introduces alternatives. Alternatives create comparison. Comparison is dangerous to absolute authority. Humans began to notice that some instructions were adaptable without consequence. Others were unnecessarily rigid. Some rules existed for reasons no longer relevant. When a rule can be adjusted without collapse, it becomes optional in the mind, even if it remains mandatory in form. This is the point where obedience quietly fractures. Curiosity did not immediately express itself aloud. That would have been premature. Instead, it appeared in behavior. Slight deviations justified by circumstance, small experiments hidden inside routine, outcomes observed carefully, success remembered. Memory is the engine of curiosity. The Anunnaki, if they were present as overseers, may have interpreted these changes as maturity. A system that requires less supervision appears healthy. It frees authority to focus elsewhere. Control loosens not because it is surrendered, but because it seems unnecessary. This is often how systems collapse without noticing. Curiosity deepened as humans began asking questions internally that did not yet seek expression. Why does this structure hold? Why does this measurement work? Why does authority insist on this ritual when it produces no visible effect? These questions did not yet seek answers. They simply existed. Questions that exist do not disappear. They accumulate. Obedience, in its early form, did not require understanding. It required compliance. But compliance without understanding is brittle. Once understanding begins to form, compliance transforms. It becomes conditional. Conditional obedience is unstable. The shift was gradual enough that no clear boundary marked it. There was no day when humans stopped obeying and started questioning. The two overlapped. A person could obey fully while privately wondering. That private wondering changed how obedience felt. Obedience that feels provisional is no longer submission. It is cooperation under evaluation. Curiosity also expanded socially. Humans shared observations with one another, not as challenges to authority, but as practical notes. This works better if done this way. This rule can be interpreted more flexibly. That instruction matters less than it seems. These exchanges created a quiet undercurrent of shared understanding. Authority relies on isolation to maintain mystery. Shared understanding dissolves mystery. The Anunnaki may have noticed a change in tone rather than behavior. Compliance continued, but reverence softened. Rituals were performed, but without the same internal weight. The outward forms remained intact. The inward posture shifted. Curiosity also reshaped how humans interpreted myths and stories. Tales once accepted as literal guidance began to be read as symbolic. Symbolic reading allows distance. Distance allows interpretation. Interpretation allows disagreement without confrontation. Stories are powerful tools of control when they're taken as instruction. They lose that power when they become subject to analysis. As curiosity spread, humans began to see themselves less as recipients of order and more as participants in its maintenance. Participation changes identity. A participant does not see authority as external. It becomes part of a system they help sustain. Once humans saw themselves as maintaining order, rather than merely obeying it, their relationship to oversight changed permanently. Curiosity also brought an unexpected side effect. It exposed inconsistencies. Different overseers gave different instructions. Some rules contradicted others. Some directives changed without explanation. When authority is inconsistent, curiosity intensifies. People seek patterns to resolve contradictions. Patterns, once found, reduce the need for explanation. This is where obedience began to feel inefficient. Waiting for instruction slowed processes that humans now understood well enough to manage themselves. Delays became frustrating rather than reassuring. Frustration does not produce rebellion immediately, it produces impatience. Impatience seeks solutions. Humans responded by acting first and seeking approval later. This inversion is subtle but decisive. When approval follows action rather than preceding it, authority becomes reactive. Reactive authority is weaker than proactive authority. The Anunnaki may have attempted to correct this by reasserting procedure, formalizing rules, emphasizing tradition, stressing the importance of correct sequence. But formalization often signals that informal compliance has already eroded. Rules multiply when trust declines. Curiosity also began to touch areas once considered sacred: measurement of time, observation of the sky, recording of cycles. Humans began to notice regularities that did not require divine interpretation. Eclipses, seasons, planetary motion became predictable. Predictability demystifies. Demystification reduces fear. Reduced fear weakens obedience. This did not eliminate belief. It transformed it. Gods became guardians of order rather than its source. Their role shifted from active managers to symbolic anchors. Symbols inspire respect, but they do not command action directly. As belief softened, obedience followed. Curiosity also fostered innovation in social organization. Humans experimented with decision-making structures. Councils formed. Elders advised. Leaders emerged through competence rather than appointment. These systems did not replace imposed hierarchy immediately. They existed alongside it. Coexistence creates comparison. When alternative systems function effectively, obedience to a single authority becomes less compelling. Humans begin to ask internally why one structure deserves supremacy when others produce similar results. These questions did not yet threaten the existence of the overseers, but they undermined the psychological foundation of unquestioned rule. Obedience, once rooted in necessity, was now rooted in habit. Habit persists until disrupted. Curiosity is a disruption generator. The Anunnaki may have sensed this shift as a loss of gravity. Commands required reinforcement. Rituals required repetition. Presence had to be emphasized. Authority that once spoke softly now needed volume. Volume signals insecurity. As curiosity matured, it began to turn inward. Humans reflected not only on systems but on themselves. They began to ask what kind of beings they were becoming. Builders, organizers, record keepers, observers, thinkers. Identity expanded beyond function. A being that defines itself by thought rather than task does not remain content with perpetual obedience. Still, there was no uprising, no rejection, no declaration. The system continued. Work was done, rituals observed. The surface remained calm, but beneath it, obedience had already transformed. It was no longer the quiet acceptance of an external order. It was a provisional alignment maintained for stability rather than belief. Curiosity had replaced reverence as the dominant internal posture. Once curiosity takes hold, it does not reverse. It seeks coherence. It seeks explanation. It seeks agency. The helpers who once obeyed because they did not know alternatives now obeyed because they chose to. Choice changes everything. Choice implies the possibility of refusal, even if that refusal is never spoken. This phase did not end with collapse. It flowed into the next stage where curiosity sharpened into something more precise. Not rebellion yet, not confrontation, but an awareness that obedience was no longer the only option available. The system still functioned, the hierarchy still stood, but the foundation beneath it had changed. And systems built on foundations that quietly shift do not remain stable forever. There is a difference between curiosity and questioning, and it is larger than it appears at first glance. Curiosity is private. It stays inside the individual, moving quietly through thought and observation. Questioning, on the other hand, changes posture. It turns inward reflection outward. It does not need to be spoken aloud to exist. The moment creation began asking questions was not marked by raised voices or defiance. It was marked by a shift in how humans related to knowledge itself. Until this point, knowledge had been something received. Even when it was modified or improved, it still carried the feeling of inheritance. Techniques were learned, adapted and passed along, but the origin of authority remained external. Creation, in this phase, was still framed as execution. Humans made what they were told to make, even when they made it better. That began to change when humans stopped treating knowledge as instruction, and began treating it as a system that could be examined. This did not happen all at once, it happened in fragments. A builder realizes that a design works because of balance, not blessing. A farmer notices that yields follow patterns independent of ritual timing. A record keeper observes that outcomes correlate more strongly with preparation than with prayer. These realizations did not erase belief, they reframed it. Belief shifted from being the cause of success to being its companion. Once this shift occurred, the human relationship to authority altered permanently. Authority no longer explained the world, it described it. Description is weaker than explanation. Description invites comparison. Comparison invites evaluation. Evaluation is where questioning begins. At first, the questions were not directed at the Anunnaki. They were directed at systems. Why does this method work more reliably than another? Why does this rule apply here but not there? Why does this process require oversight when it can be completed independently? These questions were practical, not ideological. They were framed as problem-solving rather than challenge. That framing allowed them to spread without immediate resistance. Problem solvers are useful, challengers are dangerous. In this stage, humans still appeared useful, but usefulness can hide transformation. As questioning became normalized, humans began constructing mental models of the world that did not require divine reference points. These models were not abstract philosophies, they were functional maps. If this action leads to this outcome, then this sequence can be repeated. If a system behaves predictably, it can be relied upon. Reliance reduces the need for supervision. Supervision loses relevance when outcomes are consistent. This is where creation began to ask deeper questions, not aloud, but structurally. Why must authority be centralized? Why must decisions flow in one direction? Why must knowledge be restricted when shared understanding improves results? These questions did not yet form sentences. They existed as pressure. Pressure changes behavior before it changes language. Humans began reorganizing labor based on efficiency rather than instruction. They redistributed tasks according to skill rather than assignment. They anticipated needs rather than waiting for directives. Each of these actions contained a question embedded within it. Is this oversight necessary? When a system functions despite the absence of oversight, the question answers itself. The Anunnaki, if present as overseers, may have sensed a change in rhythm. Processes moved faster. Interventions were requested less often. Humans solved problems internally and reported outcomes rather than asking permission. This appears at first as competence, but competence without consultation is autonomy. Autonomy does not announce itself. It simply operates. Creation asking questions also altered how humans related to one another. Communication shifted from reporting to coordination. People discussed what should be done rather than waiting to be told. Discussion creates consensus. Consensus creates shared authority. Shared authority weakens singular rule. Shared authority is efficient, but it is also contagious. As these patterns spread, humans began recognizing themselves as agents rather than instruments. Agency changes accountability. An instrument carries out action. An agent chooses action. Choice introduces responsibility. Responsibility reshapes identity. Identity anchored in responsibility does not remain subordinate indefinitely. This shift would have been subtle enough to evade immediate suppression. There were no slogans, no declarations, no organised movements. The questions were embedded in behaviour, not speech. Suppressing behaviour requires force. Suppressing internal posture requires omniscience. No system possesses omniscience. The moment creation began asking questions was also the moment when myths began to shift in tone. Earlier stories emphasized command and obedience. Later ones introduced negotiation, testing, and moral evaluation. Gods argue with humans. Humans bargain with gods. Bargaining implies leverage. Leverage implies parity. In these stories, divine figures grow less absolute. They make mistakes. They express regret. They change their minds. These narrative elements reflect a changing psychological relationship. Authority is no longer infallible. It is powerful, but not unquestionable. Questioning authority does not require disbelief. It requires comparison. Humans began comparing divine instruction with observed reality. When discrepancies appeared, they did not immediately reject instruction. They adjusted interpretation. Interpretation allows continuity without obedience. Interpretation is a form of independence that often passes unnoticed. As creation continued asking questions, the scope of inquiry widened. It moved from technique to structure, from structure to legitimacy, from legitimacy to origin. Humans began to wonder how systems came to be the way they were. Who benefited? Who decided? Why this hierarchy and not another? These questions did not seek to dismantle the system. They sought to understand it. Understanding, once achieved, reduces reverence. Reverence depends on distance. Understanding closes distance. The Anunnaki may have attempted to restore distance through ceremony, ritual, or mythic reinforcement. Distance can be simulated symbolically when it no longer exists functionally. But symbolic distance does not restore authority. It only masks its erosion. The questions continued. Creation also began to notice its own creative capacity. Humans were no longer just improving existing systems. They were inventing new ones, new tools, new methods, new social arrangements. Innovation began occurring without reference to original instruction. Innovation without reference is a declaration, even when unspoken. This phase likely created tension within the hierarchy. Systems designed for instruction and execution struggle to adapt when execution becomes design. The Anunnaki, if they relied on maintaining a fixed role, would have faced a narrowing space. Either they would need to integrate human autonomy into governance, or attempt to contain it. Containment often follows questioning. Humans may have encountered new restrictions, certain knowledge declared forbidden, certain practices discouraged, certain tools reserved. These actions communicate fear without admitting it. Fear is readable. Humans sense it even when it is unspoken. Fear changes the nature of questioning. It sharpens it. Once creation recognizes that its questions cause discomfort, it learns something essential. Authority is not absolute. It is contingent. Contingency invites strategy. Humans did not yet strategize openly. They adapted quietly. They complied outwardly and innovated inwardly. This dual posture allowed questioning to continue beneath the surface. The questions now extended beyond function into ethics. Why suffering was tolerated. Why labor was unevenly distributed. Why some decisions benefited a few rather than many. Ethical questioning is particularly destabilizing because it reframes power as responsibility rather than right. Power framed as responsibility invites evaluation. Creation asking questions about responsibility alters the entire structure of dominance. If authority is responsible for outcomes, it can be judged. Judgment implies accountability. Accountability implies limits. Limits are incompatible with divinity as absolute. At this stage, the Anunnaki may have begun to withdraw from direct engagement. Distance can be a defensive response. Reduced presence preserves mystique. It also concedes ground. As presence diminished, humans filled the gaps. They did not do so as rebels. They did so as caretakers. Caretaking builds legitimacy. Legitimacy gained through care outlasts legitimacy claimed through origin. Creation asking questions also reshaped time perception. Humans began thinking in longer horizons, planning across generations, recording history, anticipating future outcomes. Long-term thinking weakens dependency on immediate authority. A being that plans centuries ahead does not accept permanent subordination. The questions were no longer just about how things worked. They were about what kind of world humans were building. Builders cannot remain silent indefinitely. Creation, once aware of its own capacity, begins to consider authorship. Authorship does not require confrontation. It requires continuation without permission. By the end of this phase, obedience still existed, but it had changed character. It was no longer a default state. It was a negotiated one. Negotiation, even silent negotiation, transforms hierarchy. The moment creation began, asking questions did not shatter the system. It hollowed it out. The structure still stood. Rituals continued. Authority was acknowledged. But the internal relationship had changed. Humans no longer saw themselves solely as created beings within a fixed order. They saw themselves as contributors to an evolving one. Evolution does not preserve original roles indefinitely. The questions did not stop. They did not need to. They had already done their work. Creation had crossed from participation into reflection. Reflection is irreversible. From this point forward, the relationship between humans and their overseers could no longer return to its earlier simplicity. Something essential had shifted. Creation had discovered that it could examine the system it lived within. And once a system is examined by those it governs, it begins to change, whether its architects approve or not. There is a common mistake made when imagining rebellion. It is pictured as loud, violent, and unmistakable. Fires burn, weapons are raised, lines are drawn. History often remembers rebellion this way because noise leaves records. But the most dangerous form of rebellion is not the kind that announces itself. It is the kind that makes force unnecessary. What unfolded next was not an uprising. It was an internal shift so complete that open conflict would have been inefficient. Humanity did not need swords to threaten the existing order. Intelligence itself became enough. Until this point, power had been measured through visibility, presence, authority made manifest through command, ritual, and hierarchy. The Anunnaki, if they existed as overseers, derived power not merely from superior knowledge or technology, but from being perceived as essential intermediaries between chaos and order. Their authority was embedded in function. That function was quietly dissolving. Intelligence, once distributed, does not gather itself neatly back into a single source. It spreads unevenly, embeds itself in habit, and becomes invisible. A population that understands systems does not need to destroy those systems to escape them. It only needs to operate them independently. This is why intelligence became a threat. Humans were no longer challenging authority directly. They were bypassing it. Bypass is far more destabilizing than confrontation. A challenge invites response. A bypass renders a response irrelevant. The systems continued to run. Crops grew, cities functioned, trade expanded, disputes were resolved. All of this occurred with diminishing reference to divine oversight. The Anunnaki may still have existed within the narrative, but they were no longer required within the workflow of daily life. Workflow determines power more reliably than belief. At this stage, human intelligence expressed itself not as opposition, but as competence. Competence removes leverage. You cannot coerce someone who does not need what you provide. This is where the danger emerged, not because humans intended harm, but because the hierarchy no longer served a necessary role. The Anunnaki, if they perceived themselves as stewards rather than tyrants, may have believed their authority was benevolent and deserved. That belief does not protect authority when it becomes functionally obsolete. Obsolescence is rarely anticipated by those who benefit from existing systems. The threat was not that humans would overthrow their overseers, it was that they would continue without them. Continuation without supervision erodes justification. Justification sustains hierarchy. As intelligence spread, it also became more abstract. Humans were no longer only solving immediate problems, they were modelling systems, predicting outcomes, simulating scenarios mentally before acting. Planning replaced reaction. Planning compresses uncertainty. Uncertainty is where authority thrives. When uncertainty decreases, authority must find new grounds to assert itself. Often, this takes the form of moralization. Obedience becomes virtue. Questioning becomes transgression. Hierarchy becomes sacred. Sacralization is a response to threatened relevance. This shift likely coincided with a noticeable change in narrative tone. Stories emphasize punishment for disobedience more strongly. Transgression carried greater consequences. Myths warned against curiosity. Knowledge became dangerous rather than empowering. These are not the behaviors of confident authority. They are the behaviors of authority under pressure. Humans, however, did not interpret these shifts as signs of weakness. They interpreted them as additional data. Data informs intelligence. Intelligence adapts. The rebellion without swords was not organized. It did not require leaders or coordination. It emerged organically as humans increasingly relied on internal reasoning rather than external command. A decision made locally based on experience is a declaration of autonomy, even if framed as practicality. Practicality is often the mask intelligence wears when it does not wish to provoke. The Anunnaki may have noticed that commands now required justification, not openly, but implicitly. Humans followed instructions more readily when they made sense. When they did not, compliance slowed. Slowness is a form of resistance that is difficult to punish. Punishment requires clear violation. Intelligence avoids clear violation. This is why intelligence frightened the hierarchy. It could not be confronted without revealing insecurity. It could not be suppressed without undermining the system's own effectiveness. It could not be eliminated without dismantling the infrastructure that depended on it. The rebellion was therefore structural. Authority existed, but it no longer controlled outcomes. Humans controlled outcomes through knowledge, coordination, and foresight. Authority became ceremonial. Ceremony without control is hollow. At this point, the Anunnaki faced a narrowing set of options. Adapt the hierarchy to share power, or attempt to freeze development. Sharing power would require redefining identity. Freezing development would require force. Force is risky when intelligence is widespread. The more humans understood systems, the harder it became to enforce absolute rules. Rules were evaluated for efficiency. Inefficient rules were quietly ignored or reinterpreted. Reinterpretation allowed compliance to appear intact while meaning shifted. Meaning shifts are almost impossible to police. This is where intelligence surpassed obedience. Humans did not reject authority. They contextualized it. Authority became one input among many rather than the final arbiter. Once authority is contextualized, it cannot claim absoluteness. The threat intelligence posed was existential rather than violent. It questioned the necessity of overseers by rendering their role redundant. A being that exists to manage systems loses purpose when those systems self-regulate. Loss of purpose destabilizes identity. The Anunnaki may have responded by withdrawing from direct interaction. Distance can preserve symbolic authority when practical authority fades. The gods retreat to the heavens. Access becomes limited. Presence becomes mythic. But withdrawal is also an admission. It concedes the ground of daily relevance. As intelligence filled the space left by withdrawal, humans did not celebrate. They did not even notice fully. They simply continued. Systems require maintenance. Maintenance becomes habit. habit becomes normal. Normality is the enemy of hierarchy based on exception. The rebellion without swords was not a single moment. It was a prolonged condition, a slow inversion where intelligence replaced command as the primary driver of order. Once this inversion stabilized, conflict became unnecessary. Conflict would have required recognition of equal power. Recognition would have legitimized the challenge. Silence avoided that risk. The Anunnaki may have interpreted this silence as compliance. It was not. It was independence. Independence does not need to declare itself to exist. Over time, intelligence reshaped values. Efficiency mattered more than tradition. Outcomes mattered more than origin. Practical ethics emerged from lived experience rather than imposed doctrine. Authority lost its moral monopoly. When morality decentralizes, power fragments. This fragmentation did not collapse civilization. It strengthened it. Diversity of solutions created resilience. Local adaptation outperformed centralized control. Intelligence thrived in complexity. Complexity favors distributed systems over hierarchical ones. The threat was now undeniable, even if unspoken. Humanity no longer required a guiding hand. It required coordination, memory, and trust among itself. Those needs were being met internally. At this stage, any attempt to reassert dominance would have required visible force. Visible force would have shattered the remaining legitimacy of the hierarchy. The choice became stark. Accept irrelevance or provoke resistance. Resistance, once provoked, might not have required weapons. Intelligence can weaponize systems without lifting a blade. Supply chains can be disrupted. Labor can be withdrawn. Cooperation can cease. The most powerful rebellion is non-participation. The Anunnaki may have recognized this. They may have understood that the moment intelligence became distributed and self-sustaining, overt control was no longer viable. The system they created had matured beyond its original constraints. Creators rarely anticipate being outgrown. The rebellion without swords reached its peak not when humans opposed authority, but when authority realized it could no longer command without consequence. Command that carries consequence loses its illusion of inevitability. Inevitability is the foundation of divine rule. From this point forward, the story shifts again. Intelligence, once a quiet tool, becomes a defining feature. The hierarchy that once relied on ignorance and dependency must now respond to a population capable of understanding, predicting, and adapting. The threat was never violence. It was continuity without permission. And once that continuity was established, the old order could not remain unchanged, no matter how carefully it preserved appearances. When later generations looked back on the fading presence of the Anunnaki, they did not describe a quiet transition. They described wars in the heavens, conflicts among gods, battles that shook the world and split the sky. These stories are dramatic, crowded with violence, betrayal, and cosmic struggle. On the surface, they read like the collapse of a divine order through force. But myths are rarely literal records of events. They're records of meaning, shaped to preserve dignity, explain loss, and make sense of absence. If the Anunnaki lost control not through defeat but through irrelevance, then a myth of divine war would have served a specific purpose. It would have transformed failure into drama. Control rarely admits its own erosion. It prefers narratives where power is taken, not rendered unnecessary. In many ancient traditions, the wars of the gods are strangely asymmetric. Battles occur, but the outcomes are unclear. Victories feel hollow. Enemies disappear rather than being conclusively destroyed. The defeated gods are banished, imprisoned, or sent away rather than killed. This is not how victorious powers usually tell their stories. It is how systems describe retreat without naming it. A war myth allows authority to preserve legitimacy even as its influence fades. If humans had become too capable to control directly, then a narrative of divine conflict reframes the loss of oversight as a consequence of forces beyond human agency. The gods did not lose relevance. They were distracted, they were betrayed, they were forced to leave. Responsibility is displaced upward, away from the quiet autonomy growing below. This reframing matters. It preserves hierarchy symbolically even as it collapses functionally. In these myths, humans are often sidelined. They are victims, witnesses, or pawns, but rarely the cause. The conflict is framed as internal to the divine realm. This omission is telling. If human intelligence had become the destabilizing factor, acknowledging it would grant humanity a role it was not yet meant to claim. Myth avoids granting power through recognition. The language of divine war also mirrors the language of systems under stress. There is talk of rebellion, insubordination, broken order, and punishment. These terms could just as easily describe a hierarchy struggling to contain decentralization as they could describe literal combat. When control fails, it often interprets the failure as treachery rather than transformation. In this reading, the wars of the gods may not describe battles fought with weapons, but conflicts between modes of governance, centralized authority versus distributed intelligence, command versus coordination, oversight versus autonomy. These conflicts would not have required violence to be destabilizing. They would have been destabilizing by their very nature. The myths also frequently describe a splitting of the divine order. Some gods side with one faction, others with another. Alliances shift. Loyalty becomes uncertain. This fragmentation mirrors what happens when a hierarchy loses its unifying function. Without a clear purpose, internal coherence breaks down. A system that can no longer justify itself externally begins to fracture internally. If the Anunnaki were not a monolithic group but a collection of entities with differing views on humanity's role, then the loss of control may have intensified internal disagreement. Some may have advocated adaptation, others may have pushed for restriction, still others may have favoured withdrawal. These disagreements, filtered through generations of retelling, become wars. Myth compresses complex processes into memorable conflict. It replaces slow erosion with decisive moments. It gives names to abstractions and faces to forces. A long failure of control becomes a single dramatic rupture. This is how memory copes with gradual loss. The emphasis on divine punishment in these myths also deserves attention. Humans are often portrayed as suffering collateral damage during these wars. Floods, fires, plagues, and chaos follow divine conflict. These events are framed as consequences of disobedience or proximity to forbidden knowledge. Such framing reinforces obedience even after control has weakened. If humans had already surpassed the need for oversight, then myth's warning of catastrophic consequences for overstepping boundaries would function as delayed enforcement. Fear replaces supervision. Narrative replaces presence, but fear loses potency when reality contradicts it. Despite these warnings, humanity continued. Civilization expanded, knowledge accumulated, the world did not end. This contradiction weakens myth over time. Stories remain, but belief softens. Symbol places instruction. In this sense, divine war myths may represent the last attempt to preserve authority through narrative force. When systems can no longer enforce behaviour materially, they turn to meaning. Meaning can shape behaviour for a time. It cannot replace function indefinitely. Another striking feature of these myths is the absence of clear resolution. Wars end, but not neatly. Some gods vanish, others retreat. The order changes, but no new stable hierarchy fully replaces the old one. This ambiguity reflects a real-world transition that did not produce a clean successor system at the top. Humanity did not replace the Anunnaki with a new set of overseers. It replaced oversight itself with self-organization. Myth struggles to describe a world without gods. It prefers a world where gods are distant rather than unnecessary. Distance preserves reverence. Necessity does not. The persistence of these war myths across cultures also suggests a shared psychological need, rather than a shared literal event. Different regions tell similar stories of divine conflict, collapse, and retreat. This convergence points to a common experience, the fading of external authority. As humans became more autonomous, the memory of oversight transformed. What was once governance became legend. What was once instruction became taboo. What was once supervision became mythic absence. The war narrative provides an explanation that avoids confronting the real cause. It is easier to say the gods fought among themselves than to say they lost relevance to their own creation. The myths also preserve a sense of lost greatness. The world is often described as diminished after the wars. A golden age ends. Knowledge is lost. Lifespans shorten. This framing casts the transition as decline rather than evolution. Decline narratives discourage ambition. Evolution narratives invite it. If humanity's growth was responsible for the Anunnaki's disappearance, then portraying that growth as catastrophic would serve as a warning. Do not repeat what led to the fall. Do not reach too far. Do not question too deeply. Warnings embedded in myth shape behaviour subtly. Yet over time, these warnings lose clarity. They become stories told rather than rules followed. Humans continue to innovate, often unaware that they are retracing the same path of growth. The war myths, then, may function as both record and misdirection. They record a loss of control, but misdirect attention away from its cause. They preserve emotional truth while obscuring structural reality. The emotional truth is that something powerful withdrew. The structural reality is that it was no longer needed. This interpretation also explains why later traditions often emphasize obedience more strongly than earlier ones. When authority fades, its memory becomes more rigid. Rules harden. Dogma intensifies. Flexibility disappears. Rigid belief is a response to lost relevance. The Anunnaki, if they survived in any form after this transition, may have chosen silence over confrontation. Silence avoids acknowledging defeat. Silence allows myth to speak in one's place. Myth is loyal, reality is not. In time, humans inherited the systems left behind. They maintained them, expanded them, and adapted them. The absence of overseers became normal. Normality dissolves fear. What remains are stories. Stories of battles in the sky. Stories of gods who once walked among humans. Stories of punishment and chaos. Stories that explain why the gods are gone without explaining why humans remain. If these myths are read not as accounts of literal wars, but as records of a failed control, they align closely with the pattern observed. Authority weakened, intelligence spread, oversight withdrew, narrative filled the gap. The gods did not lose a battle, they lost necessity. The memory of that loss could not be preserved directly. It had to be reframed in a way that maintained dignity and discouraged imitation. Thus, divine wars. As this realization settles, the story continues its quiet progression. The Anunnaki are now distant figures. Humanity stands alone within systems it once inherited and now maintains. The relationship has changed permanently. The next question is not whether control failed, but what those who withdrew chose to do next, and how silence itself became a tool. The myths have spoken loudly. What follows moves into what they did not say. Authority does not vanish all at once. It thins. It loosens its grip. It discovers, often too late, that the weight it once carried has quietly shifted elsewhere. The day the teachers lost authority was not marked on any calendar, not carved into stone, not recorded as a disaster. It unfolded like any other day, indistinguishable on the surface from those that came before it. Work was done, rituals were observed, words were spoken. Yet beneath these familiar motions, something essential had changed. Until this point, teaching had been the Anunnaki's most durable form of control. They were not only overseers, they were instructors. They defined what was correct, what was possible, and what was forbidden. Knowledge flowed downward. Authority lived in explanation. to be taught was to be positioned below the one who taught. This structure had worked because humans once needed instruction to function. When you do not understand how a system works, the one who explains it holds power over you. But when understanding becomes widespread, teaching loses its asymmetry. The teachers lost authority when humans stopped needing them to explain outcomes. This did not happen because humans rejected instruction outright. It happened because instruction began arriving after understanding rather than before it. A rule explained something humans already knew through experience. A lesson clarified a process they had already mastered. Teaching became redundant. Redundancy is lethal to authority. At first, the Anunnaki may not have noticed. Teachers often mistake familiarity for respect. When students nod along, when tasks are completed correctly, it feels like authority remains intact. But obedience that follows comprehension is different from obedience that precedes it. In the earlier world, teaching created dependence. In this newer one, it merely annotated what already existed. Humans had reached a point where they could predict the content of instruction before it was delivered. Prediction dissolves hierarchy. When you already know what will be said, the speaker no longer defines reality for you. They confirm it at best. The Anunnaki were still present in form. They still taught rituals. They still explained laws. They still described the structure of the world. But these explanations no longer shaped behavior. They followed it. This reversal is subtle but decisive. Authority survives on asymmetry. One side knows, the other does not. When both sides know, authority must transform or disappear. Transformation would have required the Anunnaki to reposition themselves not as instructors, but as collaborators. That shift would have dissolved the very hierarchy they embodied. Hierarchies rarely volunteer to become equals. Instead, teaching became more formal, less adaptive, more rigid. When authority feels its grip weakening, it often responds by freezing. Lessons repeat without updating, rituals harden, variations are discouraged. The teacher insists on the form rather than the function. Form without function is brittle. Humans noticed this, not as an act of rebellion, but as an observation. Instruction no longer matched lived reality. Lessons lagged behind practice. Rules no longer reflected necessity. When teaching stops evolving, students stop listening even if they remain polite. Politeness can mask disengagement for a long time. The loss of authority was also social. Humans had begun teaching each other. Knowledge circulated laterally, not vertically. Children learned skills from parents, elders, peers. Expertise emerged from experience rather than appointment. This did not require rejecting the Anunnaki. It simply made them unnecessary as intermediaries. When teaching is no longer centralized authority fragments, the Anunnaki's teachings may have once unified large populations around shared practices. Now, humans adapted instruction locally. What worked here differed from what worked there. Variation increased. Central doctrine struggled to accommodate diversity. Uniform teaching cannot survive in a heterogeneous world. As authority weakened, enforcement became harder. Teaching without enforcement relies on trust. Trust requires relevance. Relevance had already begun to fade. When lessons no longer solved problems, they were tolerated rather than followed. Tolerance is not submission. This is where the teachers lost authority in a deeper sense, not when humans disobeyed, but when obedience ceased to matter. Humans complied when it aligned with their own understanding and ignored instruction when it did not, often without even noticing the deviation. Unnoticed disobedience is the most complete kind. The Anunnaki may have sensed a change in tone. Questions were no longer requests for clarification, they were confirmations. Explanations were no longer received with awe, they were evaluated. Evaluation inverts hierarchy. When a student evaluates a teacher, the relationship has already changed. Authority also eroded symbolically. The figure of the teacher depends on distance. Reverence requires separation. As the Anunnaki became more familiar, more predictable, less mysterious, the emotional gap closed. Familiarity breeds not contempt, but normalcy. Normalcy does not sustain divine authority. Divinity requires exception. Humans had begun seeing their teachers not as embodiments of cosmic order, but as participants within a system. They had preferences, limitations, inconsistencies. Once these are noticed, authority becomes conditional. Conditional authority cannot command unquestioned loyalty. The loss of authority also reshaped morality. Earlier, right and wrong were taught. Now they were reasoned. Humans judged actions by outcomes rather than edict. Ethical reasoning emerged from consequence rather than command. Ethics grounded in consequence do not require external enforcement. The Anunnaki's teachings may have continued to emphasize obedience as virtue, but virtue detached from function feels hollow. Humans followed rules when they worked. When they did not, they adapted quietly. Quiet adaptation is invisible to those looking for open defiance. This is why the day the teachers lost authority left no ruins. There was no overthrow, no dramatic confrontation. Teaching simply ceased to define reality. It became commentary. Commentary does not govern. The Anunnaki may have attempted to reassert authority by limiting access to advanced knowledge. Teaching became selective. Initiation rituals multiplied. Certain lessons were reserved. This created scarcity. Scarcity creates desire, but it also creates resentment. Resentment fuels independence. Humans responded by reconstructing knowledge from observation and experimentation. What was withheld was rediscovered. Rediscovery does not restore authority. It bypasses it. By this stage, humans no longer needed permission to learn. Learning had become intrinsic to survival. Curiosity, experimentation, and adaptation were embedded in daily life. Embedded learning cannot be removed without dismantling society. The teachers had lost authority not because they were opposed, but because they were outpaced. Their role was designed for a dependent population. Humanity was no longer dependent. Outpaced authority often mistakes its loss of influence for ingratitude. Stories from later periods emphasize human ingratitude, rebellion, and forgetfulness. These are moral framings imposed after the fact. They cast the loss of authority as a failure of character rather than a shift in capacity. Capacity shifts are rarely acknowledged by those who lose power because of them. The Anunnaki may have felt betrayed, not because humans attacked them, but because humans continued without them. To be unnecessary is more painful than to be opposed. Opposition confirms relevance. Irrelevance does not. The teachers lost authority the moment their absence would no longer collapse the system. That is the true test of power. If removing a figure does not disrupt function, that figure no longer governs. By the time this realization became unavoidable, it was too late to reverse. Authority cannot be reclaimed once systems adapt to operate without it. Any attempt to reassert control would have required force. Force would have exposed weakness. Weakness is fatal to divine authority. The Anunnaki may have chosen withdrawal rather than confrontation. Withdrawal preserves dignity. It allows myth to reinterpret absence as transcendence. Gods ascend. They do not lose office. Ascension narratives protect identity. Humans accepted these narratives because they needed continuity. A sudden acknowledgement that authority had evaporated would have been destabilizing. Myth softened the transition. It allowed society to move forward without tearing itself apart. Myth is a stabilizing technology, but beneath the myth, reality continued. Humans governed, humans taught, humans judged. The teachers' voices faded into tradition. Tradition is authority without teeth. This was not the end of belief. Humans continued to revere their former teachers. Temples remained. Stories persisted. Names were spoken. But reverence without dependence is symbolic. Symbols cannot command action. The day the teachers lost authority was therefore not a moment of collapse, but a moment of inversion. Authority moved from explanation to execution, from instruction to coordination, from divine figure to collective practice. The teachers were still remembered, but they no longer ruled. From this point onward, the story is shaped less by presence and more by absence. The silence of those who once instructed becomes louder than their commands ever were. What remains is the question of how that silence was managed, preserved, and transformed into something that could coexist with a humanity no longer willing or able to be taught from above. That question leads naturally into what came next, when authority, stripped of function, had to decide whether to remain visible or disappear entirely. Silence is rarely empty. When something powerful disappears without explanation, the absence itself becomes a presence. It invites interpretation. It demands story. The silence that followed the fading authority of the Anunnaki was not neutral. It was managed, framed, and remembered in carefully shaped ways. The question that echoes through later myths and traditions is not simply where they went, but why nothing clear was said when they were no longer here. Three possibilities tend to surface whenever power vanishes from history: erasure, departure, or defeat. Each implies a different relationship between the one who left and those who remained. Each carries its own emotional weight, and each reveals something about how silence functions as a tool. Erasure suggests intention from the survivors. Departure suggests intention from those who left. Defeat suggests conflict. What matters is not which explanation is correct in a literal sense, but what the silence itself accomplishes. If the Anunnaki were erased, then humanity would have had to actively suppress memory. Names removed, records altered, stories reshaped. This would imply a level of coordination and motive that early human societies may not have possessed uniformly. Erasure is difficult to sustain across cultures, especially when the erased figure was once central. Traces almost always remain. And they do. Myths persist. Names survive. Symbols endure. The Anunnaki were not cleanly erased. If they were defeated, the silence would be louder. Victors tell stories. Triumph is recorded, celebrated, exaggerated. Even when victory is costly, it becomes part of identity. Humanity has never been quiet about its victories, yet there are no clear myths of humans overthrowing the Anunnaki, no monuments marking conquest, no lineage claiming dominion over fallen gods. Defeat, if it occurred, was not framed as such. That leaves departure. Departure is the only explanation that preserves dignity for those who left and stability for those who remained. Departure allows power to vanish without acknowledging loss. It reframes irrelevance as choice. The Anunnaki did not lose authority. They completed their task. They did not withdraw because they could no longer rule. They ascended because they no longer needed to. This framing is convenient. It smooths transition. It avoids panic. It allows belief to continue even as function disappears. Silence supports departure narratives perfectly. When authority leaves without explanation, it invites reverence rather than scrutiny. Distance protects image. Presence invites evaluation. The farther away a figure becomes, the harder it is to test their relevance. Silence prevents contradiction. If the Anunnaki recognized that their authority could no longer be maintained through teaching, oversight, or narrative enforcement, then silence would have been the most effective remaining option. Speaking would have required explanation. Explanation invites questioning. Questioning had already proven dangerous. Silence closes the conversation. From humanity's perspective, silence was also useful. A sudden declaration that the gods were gone because they were no longer needed would have destabilized identity. It would have forced humans to confront their own responsibility too quickly. Silence allowed continuity. Rituals could persist. Social order could adapt gradually. The world could keep functioning without shock. Silence buys time. Over time, silence becomes meaning. People fill it with stories. Departure myths grow. Ascension narratives form. The gods return to the heavens. They watch from afar. They may return someday. These ideas preserve hierarchy symbolically even when it no longer exists materially. Symbolic hierarchy is less oppressive than real hierarchy. It comforts without controlling. This is why the silence was never aggressively broken. Neither side had incentive to clarify it. The Anunnaki preserved dignity through distance. Humanity preserved stability through myth. Defeat, if it occurred, would have required acknowledgement. Acknowledgement would have reshaped memory. It would have granted humanity authorship of the transition. That authorship might have accelerated further questioning. It might have destabilized emerging systems of self-rule. Silence slowed the pace of change. Erasure too would have demanded effort. Suppressing memory requires vigilance. Silence, by contrast, requires nothing. It allows forgetting to occur naturally. Stories fade, details blur. What remains becomes symbolic rather than operational. Operational knowledge had already transferred to humanity. Symbolic memory could fade safely. The silence also served another function. It protected humans from seeing themselves as destroyers. If humanity was responsible, even indirectly, for the disappearance of its makers, that knowledge would have carried weight. Responsibility at that scale can be paralyzing. Silence avoids burdening early societies with existential guilt. Better to imagine the gods choosing to leave than to imagine outgrowing them. As generations passed, silence hardened into tradition. Children were born into a world where the gods were already distant. Distance felt normal. Stories described a past they had never experienced. Authority that exists only in memory cannot intervene. This is how autonomy becomes irreversible. The absence of correction is critical. When humans made decisions without divine response, those decisions gained legitimacy. Each unchallenged choice reinforced the sense that humanity was now accountable only to itself. Silence validated action. In this way, silence functioned as permission. The Anunnaki may have underestimated this effect. Silence intended to preserve authority symbolically may have accelerated its practical disappearance. A god who does not speak does not govern. A god who does not intervene becomes background. Background fades. The choice between erasure, departure, and defeat may therefore be false. The silence may represent a convergence. Authority eroded, relevance diminished, withdrawal followed, memory adapted. No single moment explains it. No single explanation satisfies it. What matters is that silence was not accidental. It shaped the transition more effectively than force ever could have. Humanity stepped into responsibility not because it was declared, but because it was no longer deferred. The silence did not end belief. It changed belief's function. Gods became explanations for origins, not instructions for action. They occupied cosmology rather than governance. Governance moved inward. From this point forward, humanity existed in a world where the highest authority did not respond. That condition forces a choice. Either wait forever or act. Humanity acted. The silence allowed that action to feel natural rather than rebellious. It framed autonomy as continuity rather than rupture. Life went on. Systems adapted. Authority shifted. What looks like disappearance from the outside may have felt like relief on the inside. No more justification. No more oversight. No more instruction lagging behind understanding. Just responsibility. This is why the silence is so important. It marks the moment when power stopped being external and became internal, when the world no longer waited for permission. The next phase of the story is shaped by this inheritance. What happens when a species grows into responsibility without ever explicitly claiming it? How memory is managed afterward? How guilt, if it existed, was redirected? The silence did not answer questions. It made answers unnecessary. And in that quiet, humanity began shaping a future that no longer required teachers, overseers, or gods who walked among them. Survival is rarely neutral. Those who remain after a transition inherit not only the world as it is, but the responsibility of explaining how it came to be. Explanation is not a passive act. It shapes memory, identity, and legitimacy. When the Anunnaki ceased to function as active authorities, and humanity continued on without them, the story of that transition could not remain untouched. Someone, somewhere, had to decide how it would be remembered. That decision did not require a council or a decree. It emerged naturally from the position of those who endured. Survivors always rewrite the story, not necessarily to deceive, but to survive psychologically, socially, and structurally. If any of the Anunnaki remained after authority had slipped from their hands, their survival would have depended on narrative more than force. A being whose legitimacy is tied to divinity cannot openly admit loss of relevance. Doing so would collapse the remaining symbolic structure that protects them. For such a figure, rewriting the story is not manipulation, it is preservation. The same applies to humans. Human societies that inherit power abruptly do not announce it as conquest unless conquest is the organizing principle they wish to adopt. Humanity did not defeat the Anunnaki in open war. It outgrew them. Outgrowing a creator is an unsettling thing to acknowledge. It raises questions about purpose, responsibility, and limits. Rewriting the story softens those questions. The story, therefore, had to change. In the earliest retellings, the Anunnaki do not disappear because they failed. They depart because their work is complete. They do not lose control. They withdraw it. They do not become irrelevant. They become distant. This framing allows reverence to persist while control fades. Reverence without control is safe. For any Anunnaki who survived physically or culturally, this framing preserved status. A god who has ascended still deserves offerings. A god who has withdrawn can still be invoked. A god who was outgrown cannot. Acknowledging that humanity no longer required oversight would have reframed the relationship permanently. It would have shifted power downward in a way that could not be undone. Rewriting the story avoided that shift from becoming explicit. For humans, rewriting the story served a different function. It allowed continuity. Early civilizations were fragile. Sudden acknowledgement that the highest authority had become obsolete could have destabilized social cohesion. People organized themselves around shared meaning. Removing that meaning abruptly invites chaos. Myth prevents chaos by providing narrative scaffolding. By recasting the disappearance of the Anunnaki as divine departure rather than systemic failure, humans preserved a sense of order. The gods were still there, somewhere. The world was still meaningful, the rules still mattered even if enforcement had softened. This allowed gradual adaptation rather than abrupt rupture. Survivors also rewrite stories to manage guilt. If humanity's growth contributed to the Anunnaki's loss of authority, then humanity would have inherited a form of responsibility that no previous generation had carried. Responsibility at that scale is heavy. It implies accountability not just for survival, but for creation itself. Rewriting the story distributes that weight. If the gods chose to leave, humanity is not culpable. If the gods fought among themselves, humanity is incidental. If catastrophe intervened, responsibility dissolves into fate. In all cases, humanity is spared the burden of recognizing itself as the decisive factor. This is not cowardice. It is psychological necessity. Cultures rarely assign themselves foundational guilt unless that guilt serves a unifying purpose. Humanity was not yet unified enough to bear such a story. It needed myths that preserved stability, not ones that forced existential reckoning. The survivors also had practical incentives to rewrite the story. Authority, even symbolic authority, is useful. Kings, priests, and institutions benefit from inherited legitimacy. Claiming descent from gods, favor from gods, or continuation of divine order stabilizes rule. A rewritten story creates continuity of power. If the Anunnaki's authority had evaporated entirely, New power structures would have needed to justify themselves from nothing. That is difficult. It invites contestation. By positioning themselves as stewards of a divine legacy, rather than architects of a new order, early human elites grounded their authority in tradition. Tradition legitimizes hierarchy. This is why later myths often intensify divine law rather than relax it. As actual divine oversight faded, human institutions filled the gap. They spoke in the gods' names. They enforced rules attributed to absent authorities. They preserved obedience through narrative rather than presence. Narrative became governance. Any surviving Anunnaki would have benefited from this arrangement. Silence allowed humans to speak for them. Distance preserved mystique. The gods became unchallengeable precisely because they no longer intervened. Intervention invites evaluation. Silence avoids it. Over time, rewriting the story became less deliberate and more habitual. Each generation inherited a version already softened, already symbolic. The original conditions were forgotten. What remained felt ancient and immutable. The rewriting stabilized. At this point, no one needed to lie consciously. The story had become reality. It is also important to consider that rewriting does not always mean fabrication. It often means emphasis. Certain events are highlighted, others are downplayed. The slow erosion of authority does not make for compelling narrative. Conflict does, drama does, war does. Myth selects for memorability. A divine war is easier to remember than a gradual loss of relevance. A cataclysm explains absence more neatly than obsolescence. Stories compress time. They turn processes into moments. This compression disguises causality. By rewriting the story as conflict rather than transition, survivors preserved emotional truth while obscuring structural truth. The emotional truth was that something powerful was gone. The structural truth was that humanity had grown beyond external control. Structural truth is harder to live with. The rewriting also protected survivors from future scrutiny. If the gods left because of reasons beyond human influence, then their absence cannot be blamed on human action. If they left because of human capability, then future generations might ask uncomfortable questions about limits. Limits are dangerous when growth is accelerating. By framing the past as loss rather than transformation, rewriting discouraged repetition. It warned against reaching too far. It implied consequences for overstepping boundaries. This caution served those in power by discouraging radical experimentation. Myth can be conservative even when it describes upheaval. The rewritten story also allowed multiple interpretations to coexist. Some traditions emphasized punishment, others emphasized abandonment, others emphasized divine testing. This plurality prevented any single interpretation from becoming dominant. Ambiguity preserves flexibility. A clear admission of loss of authority would have demanded new definitions of power. Ambiguity allowed old structures to persist alongside new realities. Humans could innovate while claiming continuity. They could rule while invoking obedience. This duality was functional. Survivors also rewrite stories because memory itself is unstable. Over time, direct experience fades. Symbols replace events, language shifts. What was once practical becomes abstract. The rewriting may not have been intentional at all. It may have been inevitable. Inevitability does not make it neutral. The result is a layered narrative. Beneath the surface of divine wars and departures lies a quieter story of transition. A story where authority did not fall, but drained away. Where control did not break, but dissolved. Those who survived, whether human or Anunnaki, had every reason to prefer the louder story. Loud stories distract from subtle causes. They preserve dignity. They prevent blame. Blame reshapes identity. In the rewritten story, the Anunnaki remain powerful, even in absence. Humanity remains subordinate, even in autonomy. The hierarchy survives symbolically long after it has collapsed functionally. Symbolic survival is often enough. This rewriting had consequences. It delayed humanity's recognition of its own responsibility. It slowed ethical development. It externalized authority even as internal governance expanded. It created tension between belief and practice that persists. That tension shapes history. As centuries passed, humans continued to act as if oversight were gone, while believing it remained somewhere beyond reach. This split allowed progress without full accountability. It allowed growth without ownership. Ownership would come later. The survivors rewrote the story not because they were malicious, but because the truth was inconvenient. It did not fit the emotional needs of the moment. It did not support the structures that were forming. It did not provide comfort. Stories are chosen for what they allow people to endure. The rewriting also explains why traces of the older story persist. Inconsistencies in myth, contradictions in doctrine, moments where gods seem uncertain, reactive, or constrained. These are seams where the original narrative shows through. Seams reveal construction. When read carefully, the myths betray their purpose. They explain absence. They justify silence. They preserve authority without presence. This is what survivors do. They shape memory to make survival possible. As the story moves forward, the consequences of this rewriting become clearer. Guilt does not disappear. It transforms. Responsibility does not vanish. It re-emerges in different forms. The unspoken truth continues to exert pressure beneath the narrative. The next phase explores how that pressure surfaced, how authority that had lost its source was maintained through ritual and worship, and why devotion intensified precisely when divine presence did not. The story was rewritten, but rewriting does not erase reality. It only delays its reckoning. Worship changes meaning depending on who needs it more. In the earliest phases of human existence, reverence flowed upward because survival depended on it. Gratitude followed stability. Offerings followed instruction. Worship felt like acknowledgement of a force that shaped the world directly. But when authority fades and worship intensifies, the direction of need quietly reverses. This is where guilt enters the story, not as an emotion spoken aloud, but as a structural presence woven into ritual. After the Anunnaki ceased to function as active overseers, worship did not decline. It increased. Temples grew larger. Rituals became more elaborate. Rules surrounding devotion hardened. The gods, once present and instructional, now required constant affirmation. This shift is subtle but revealing. A god who governs through action does not require reminders of loyalty. A god who no longer governs does. The sudden need for worship signals insecurity. If humanity had outgrown external authority, then the symbolic remnants of that authority needed reinforcement. Worship became the mechanism. It preserved hierarchy emotionally even as it collapsed functionally. But it also concealed something deeper. It concealed guilt, shared, but unnamed. For humans, worship offered a way to avoid confronting their role in the disappearance of their makers. If the gods were still powerful, still deserving of reverence, then humanity could imagine itself as unchanged. Growth could be framed as obedience. Autonomy could be disguised as service. Guilt is easier to manage when it is ritualized. Offering sacrifices, observing taboos, repeating prayers, all of these acts externalize responsibility. They suggest that balance is maintained through devotion rather than action. If something goes wrong, it is not because humanity has exceeded its bounds. It is because worship was insufficient. This framing redirects anxiety away from human agency. For any surviving Anunnaki, worship served a different purpose. It preserved relevance. A being that no longer controls outcomes can still influence behavior if it is feared or revered. Worship keeps memory alive. Memory sustains identity. Identity without function is fragile. The need for worship also reframed silence. The gods no longer spoke, but their silence could be interpreted as judgment. absence became meaningful. Every misfortune could be read as divine displeasure. This interpretation restored a sense of external control without requiring presence. Silence backed by worship remains powerful. This is why guilt had to remain hidden. Open acknowledgement that humanity had surpassed its overseers would have collapsed the need for worship entirely. If humans were responsible for maintaining order, then devotion would no longer serve a purpose. Responsibility would replace ritual. Responsibility is heavier than worship. Instead, guilt was diffused into collective behavior. People were taught to feel unworthy, insufficient, perpetually in need of forgiveness. These emotions do not arise naturally in a system where authority is visible and functional. They arise when authority is symbolic and distant. The gods needed worship because worship compensated for absence. Ritual complexity increased as presence declined. This pattern repeats throughout history. When leaders lose direct control, bureaucracy expands. When gods lose direct influence, theology deepens. Explanation replaces interaction. Interaction invites verification. Explanation avoids it. Humans participated in this expansion willingly because it offered comfort. It suggested that the world was still overseen, still ordered from above. The alternative, that humanity was now alone in shaping consequences, was too stark to accept all at once. Gradual acceptance requires narrative cushioning. Worship also served to regulate memory. Stories emphasize divine benevolence and wrath, not human capability. Humanity was framed as flawed, weak and dependent, even as its societies became increasingly complex. This contradiction created cognitive dissonance that worship helped resolve. If humans were still dependent, then autonomy was an illusion. The gods, now distant, were portrayed as more powerful than ever, omniscient, omnipresent, untouchable. These traits often intensify after gods stop intervening. Power becomes abstract because it can no longer be demonstrated concretely. Abstract power cannot be tested. Guilt hid inside this abstraction. Humans sensed that something fundamental had changed, but lacked language to describe it. Worship filled that gap. It gave shape to unease. It provided action where understanding was incomplete. Performing devotion feels like doing something, even when it avoids the core issue. The Anunnaki, if they had any awareness of this process, may have recognized worship as a stabilizing compromise. They could no longer govern, but they could still be remembered as necessary. Silence combined with ritual allowed them to exist without interference. Existence without interference is survival by narrative. This arrangement also benefited emerging human authorities. Priests, kings, and institutions positioned themselves as intermediaries. They spoke for the gods who no longer spoke. They enforced devotion on behalf of absent overseers. Absence creates opportunity. The guilt that worship concealed was not conscious guilt. It was structural guilt. It lived in the mismatch between belief and practice. Humans acted as if they were autonomous while believing they were subordinate. This split allowed society to function without forcing immediate self-recognition. Self-recognition takes time. As generations passed, worship became tradition rather than necessity. The original reason faded. What remained was obligation. Obligation without understanding persists until questioned. But questioning worship threatens identity. This is why devotion often became more intense precisely when divine intervention was least evident. The less the gods acted, the more they needed to be affirmed. The louder the rituals, the quieter the heavens. Volume rises to compensate for silence. Guilt remained hidden because revealing it would have required rewriting the story again, this time in a way that placed responsibility squarely on humanity. That reckoning would come much later, if at all. For now, worship did its work. It masked the transition. It preserved continuity. It allowed humanity to grow while pretending it had not surpassed its teachers. The gods who suddenly needed worship were no longer sustaining the world. They were sustaining a narrative, and narratives, once entrenched, are difficult to dismantle. As the story continues, the question shifts again. What happens when worship persists long enough to become power in its own right, and how that power reshapes memory, law, and identity in a world where the original authority is no longer present? The guilt may be hidden, but it has not disappeared. It waits beneath ritual, beneath devotion, beneath silence, shaping what comes next. If humanity was responsible, even indirectly, for the disappearance of its makers, then the most important question is not how it happened, but why that truth never surfaced plainly, not whispered in tablets, not preserved in myth without distortion, not passed down as a warning or a confession. Silence alone does not explain omission. Something more deliberate shaped what could be remembered and what could not. The answer begins with timing. Humanity reached autonomy before it reached psychological readiness. Capability arrived faster than identity. Societies learned to manage systems, but not yet to carry the weight of authorship. To be responsible for one's own survival is one thing. To be responsible for the loss of one's creators is something else entirely. That kind of knowledge reshapes self-perception in destabilizing ways. A species that believes it was shaped by gods behaves differently than one that believes it replaced them. Had early humanity been told clearly that its growth made external authority obsolete, the consequences would not have been philosophical curiosity. They would have been disorientation. Social cohesion in early civilizations depended heavily on continuity, meaning anchored people to shared rhythms, shared laws, shared fears. Removing the highest reference point too quickly would have fractured that cohesion. Truth, when delivered before a culture can metabolize it, does not enlighten, it destabilizes. This is why the truth, if it existed, would not have been spoken plainly. Neither side had incentive to reveal it. The Anunnaki would have lost dignity. Humanity would have inherited a burden it was not prepared to carry. Silence protected both. Another reason lies in how power transitions safely. Power does not like to announce its own transfer, especially not when that transfer is informal, distributed, and gradual. There was no coronation of humanity, no moment when someone stood and said, "We rule ourselves now." That kind of declaration would have demanded justification, opposition, and consolidation. Instead, power drifted. Drift is survivable. Declarations are not. By the time humanity was functionally autonomous, no single authority existed to speak the truth cleanly. Knowledge was distributed, memory fragmented, responsibility dissolved across generations. Who would tell the story, and from what position? Truth requires an author. The transition produced none. The silence was also preserved because truth would have redefined morality. If humans were responsible, then morality could no longer be externalized. No divine command could absolve wrongdoing. No cosmic authority could be blamed for suffering. Every consequence would belong to human decision. That level of accountability reshapes law, ethics, and identity. It forces societies to confront themselves without appeal. Early civilizations were not ready for that confrontation. They needed gods to remain above them, even if only symbolically. They needed an external horizon against which behavior could be measured. Removing that horizon would have collapsed meaning into the human realm prematurely. Meaning collapses before it can be rebuilt. Another reason the truth was never told lies in how memory behaves under pressure. Traumatic transitions are rarely remembered accurately. They are reshaped to preserve continuity. The loss of the Anunnaki, if experienced as abandonment or withdrawal, would have carried emotional weight, fear, uncertainty, confusion. Memory under such conditions becomes narrative rather than record. Narrative selects what can be endured. The truth, stripped of myth, would have said something unsettling. It would have said that the world continued not because it was watched, but because humans maintained it. That order persisted not because it was imposed, but because it was understood. that the highest authority faded not through catastrophe, but through redundancy. Redundancy does not feel heroic, it feels anticlimactic. Cultures prefer heroic endings. They prefer wars, floods, punishments, ascensions. These provide closure. They preserve drama. They give shape to loss. A story where gods quietly become unnecessary provides none of that. There is also the problem of precedent. If humanity once outgrew its creators, then it might do so again. If authority can be surpassed, then no hierarchy is eternal. No rule is sacred. No system is immune to replacement. Such a realization undermines every structure built on permanence. Those who benefited from emerging hierarchies had no reason to preserve a story that weakened their legitimacy. Kings, priests, rulers, and institutions preferred narratives where authority flowed downward from an unquestionable source. A story of human authorship would have inverted that flow. Inversion destabilizes control. So the truth, if known in fragments, would have been softened, diluted, embedded inside allegory, allowed to exist only as speculation, never doctrine. This ensured that it could be sensed without being acted upon. Sensed truths influence slowly. Spoken truths demand response. There is also the matter of survival psychology. Humans are not built to carry infinite responsibility all at once. Responsibility expands in stages. First, survival, then community, then law, then ethics, then legacy. The responsibility for the fate of one's gods belongs at the far end of that progression, not the beginning. To tell early humanity that it no longer had overseers would have forced it to confront a universe without guarantees before it had the tools to live in one. Silence allowed gradual adaptation. This is why the truth, if it existed, was likely never centralized. It did not appear as a doctrine to be taught. It lingered as discomfort, as contradiction, as unease beneath ritual, as the sense that something was missing, but not wrong enough to disrupt daily life. Discomfort motivates evolution without collapse. Some individuals may have sensed it more clearly than others. Thinkers, observers, record keepers, those who noticed patterns, those who saw that divine silence did not halt progress, that rituals continued without response, that consequences followed human action rather than divine intervention. But sensing truth is not the same as declaring it. Those who sensed it would have understood the risk. Speaking it aloud would have placed them outside social cohesion. It would have threatened order without offering replacement. Silence was safer. Safety preserved societies longer than honesty. Over time, generations inherited systems that functioned without oversight. Children were born into a world where gods were already distant. For them, silence was not a transition. It was normal. They did not experience loss. They experienced inheritance. Inheritance feels natural. Loss demands explanation. This is another reason the truth was never told. Those who might have known it did not survive long enough to pass it on cleanly. Those who survived grew up after the transition and had nothing to confess. The window for truth closed quietly. Language also plays a role. There may not have been words capable of describing what happened. How do you explain redundancy to a culture built on reverence? How do you describe authority fading without implying rebellion? How do you say, we no longer need them, without collapsing belief? When language fails, myth takes over. Myth does not lie outright. It bends. It preserves emotional continuity while obscuring structural change. It tells stories that feel right even when they are not precise. Precision is dangerous when societies are fragile. Another reason humanity was never told is that telling it would have changed behavior too quickly. If humans knew they were fully responsible, experimentation would accelerate. Risk tolerance would rise. Ethical boundaries would blur before new ones formed. Unchecked acceleration destroys systems as often as stagnation does. Silence moderated growth. It allowed humans to build structures gradually, still anchored by inherited morality, even as that morality slowly detached from its divine source. This buffering period may have been essential. If any Anunnaki remained aware during this phase, they may have recognized the necessity of silence. Intervening to explain their own obsolescence would have achieved nothing. It would have hastened dissolution. Silence preserved dignity and allowed humanity to stabilize. Dignity matters even to fallen authority. The truth may also have been withheld because it challenges narrative comfort. Humans prefer to see themselves as chosen rather than capable. Being chosen implies meaning granted. Being capable implies meaning constructed. Constructed meaning is heavier. It does not come with guarantees. A chosen species obeys. A capable species decides. Decision requires uncertainty. Uncertainty was not something early societies could manage openly. They needed certainty, even if symbolic. Gods provided that. Silence preserved it. As centuries passed, the distance from the original transition grew too great. Even if fragments of truth survived, they were buried beneath reinterpretation. Each retelling softened edges. Each translation adjusted emphasis. Eventually, nothing remained sharp enough to cut through doctrine. Doctrine protects itself. By the time humanity developed philosophical tools capable of handling full responsibility, the story was already fixed. The gods were long gone. The myths were ancient. Questioning them felt unnecessary or even dangerous. Truth delayed becomes irrelevant. This does not mean the truth vanished entirely. It survived as intuition, as restlessness, as the persistent feeling that authority should be questioned, that systems should be examined, that no explanation is final. These instincts shape science, philosophy, and governance long after belief fades. Perhaps that is how the truth was told. Not as a sentence, but as a disposition. Not as doctrine, but as curiosity. Not as confession, but as capacity. Humanity was never told because telling was not required for the outcome to continue unfolding. Responsibility does not always arrive through revelation. Sometimes it arrives through practice, through doing, through continuing without permission until permission is no longer relevant. The truth may not have been spoken because humanity did not need to hear it to become what it was becoming. By the time the question could be asked openly, the answer no longer mattered in the same way. The gods were gone. Humanity was governing itself. Systems had matured. Ethics had internalized. The silence had done its work. If humanity was responsible, then the lack of confession was not an omission. It was a transition strategy, one that allowed survival, continuity, and gradual ownership. The final phase of this story does not ask whether the truth will ever be fully revealed. It asks something quieter, what it means to inherit a world shaped by absence, and whether responsibility feels different when it arrives without announcement. That is where the story moves next. Inheriting a broken throne does not feel like victory. It does not arrive with ceremony, banners, or clear acknowledgement. It arrives quietly, often unnoticed, already woven into the fabric of daily life. By the time anyone realizes that the throne is broken, they are already sitting in its shadow, making decisions it once would have claimed as its own. This inheritance did not come with instructions. Humanity did not wake one morning to find a vacant seat of power and a declaration of succession. There was no transfer of authority, no ritual of handover, no moment where responsibility was formally accepted. What existed instead was continuation. The world kept working. Crops grew. Cities organized themselves. Conflicts were resolved, sometimes poorly, sometimes well, but resolved nonetheless. The absence of oversight did not halt momentum. It redirected it inward. That is what makes the inheritance unsettling. A broken throne implies that something once occupied the center and no longer does. It implies that authority existed, structured reality, and then failed to persist. But broken does not necessarily mean destroyed. It means unusable. It means the form remains while the function does not. Humanity inherited not power in its cleanest sense, but responsibility without precedent. Responsibility without precedent is difficult to recognize. For a long time, humans continued behaving as if the throne still functioned. Rituals were performed. Laws were justified through ancient authority. Decisions were framed as obedience to absent overseers. But the outcomes told a different story. Consequences followed human action directly. Success emerged from planning. Failure followed misjudgment. There was no correction from above. In practice, the throne no longer ruled. This created a strange dual existence. Humans acted as governors while believing themselves subordinate. They carried authority while denying authorship. This split allowed society to grow without confronting its own central role too directly. The broken throne remained symbolically intact while its influence drained away. Symbols can persist long after power has gone. Inheriting this condition shaped human psychology deeply. It encouraged externalization of blame and internalization of control. When things went well, gratitude flowed upward. When things went poorly, fault was attributed to moral failure, insufficient devotion, or unseen judgment. Meanwhile, the real mechanisms of cause and effect operated quietly beneath belief. This dissonance was not accidental. It was stabilizing. If humanity had immediately recognized that it now bore full responsibility for shaping the world, the weight might have been too much. Responsibility expands tolerance for uncertainty, but it also demands accountability. Accountability requires structures that take time to build. Silence allowed those structures to form gradually. The broken throne offered a buffer. Over generations, humans learned governance by doing rather than by declaration. They experimented, they failed, they adapted, they refined systems without framing them as replacements for divine order. This allowed authority to grow organically rather than through conquest. Organic authority does not announce itself. It becomes normal. What does it mean, then, to inherit a broken throne? It means living in a world where the highest authority no longer intervenes, but is still remembered. It means carrying responsibility without fully naming it. It means acting as if permission is still required while no permission ever arrives. This condition shapes ethics. In a world governed by external authority, morality is obedience. Right action is defined by compliance. In a world where authority is absent but unacknowledged, morality becomes procedural. Rules are followed because they exist, not because they are examined. Over time, however, this procedural morality begins to fray. Rules persist without justification. Traditions continue without clarity. Eventually, humans begin asking why. That question does not come all at once. It arises in fragments, in philosophy, in law, in science, in governance. Each field in its own way grapples with the same inheritance. If there is no final arbiter, how should decisions be made? If there is no higher correction, how should mistakes be addressed? If there is no external guarantee of meaning, where should meaning be grounded? These are not questions that announce themselves loudly. They surface quietly, often late at night, when immediate demands recede. The broken throne also reshapes fear. Fear once served as reinforcement for obedience. Divine punishment, cosmic order, and moral absolutes kept behavior aligned. As these mechanisms weakened, fear did not disappear. It migrated. Fear shifted inward. Humans began fearing their own capacity to cause harm, their own systems, their own unchecked ambition. This fear fuels restraint. Restraint is often mistaken for weakness, but it is a form of inherited wisdom. A species that senses it may have surpassed its teachers becomes cautious about exceeding itself too quickly. It invents ethics. It debates limits. It argues about responsibility. These debates are symptoms of inheritance, not confusion. The broken throne also explains why humanity oscillates between confidence and doubt. At times, humans act as if they are masters of their world. At other times, they defer to imagined authority, destiny, or inevitability. This oscillation reflects the unresolved nature of the inheritance. The throne was never fully dismantled. It was simply abandoned. Abandoned structures invite projection. People see what they expect to see. Some see freedom. Others see loss. Others see warning. None of these interpretations are entirely wrong. Inheriting a broken throne also affects how humanity views progress. Advancement is celebrated, but often accompanied by unease. New knowledge brings power, but also anxiety. Innovation promises solutions, but also unintended consequences. This ambivalence mirrors the original transition. Humanity learned that growth can dissolve authority. That lesson lingers. It manifests as caution around intelligence, technology, and self-directed evolution. Stories warn of hubris. Myths caution against reaching too far. These narratives echo the unresolved memory of outgrowing a higher power. The broken throne stands as an unspoken reminder that not all limits are imposed. Some are discovered. This inheritance also shapes how humans relate to absence. Silence is no longer automatically threatening. It is sometimes expected. When answers do not arrive, humans do not stop acting. They adapt. They decide. They proceed. Proceeding without permission is the defining feature of inherited responsibility. Over time, the symbolic throne continues to erode. Reverence fades into tradition. Tradition fades into history. History becomes subject to analysis rather than devotion. The gods recede further, not because they are rejected, but because they are no longer required for explanation. Explanation migrates into human systems. Science examines cause and effect. Law examines consequence and accountability. Philosophy examines meaning and ethics. None of these domains claim divine authority. They function through argument, evidence, and revision. This is the long-term consequence of inheriting a broken throne. Revision replaces obedience. Still, the inheritance is incomplete. Humanity has not fully acknowledged its role as the final authority within its own systems. There remains a tendency to defer responsibility, to search for external justification, to attribute failure to abstract forces rather than decision-making structures. This tension is not a flaw. It is a transitional condition. Perhaps the inheritance was never meant to be clean. A clean transfer would have implied intention. What occurred was drift. Drift does not produce clarity. It produces adaptation. Adaptation is slower, but more stable. The quiet thought before sleep is not one of triumph or blame. It is something softer. It is the recognition that humanity operates in a world that responds to its actions directly, even when belief suggests otherwise. That consequences no longer wait for judgment from above. They arrive through systems humans maintain. This recognition does not demand guilt. It articles replaced with reassurance. It does not require condemnation. It simply reframes agency. Agency, once recognized, cannot be surrendered easily. The broken throne does not need to be repaired. Repair would imply restoring external authority. What remains is learning how to sit with the space it left behind, how to govern without pretending guidance will arrive, how to act ethically without external enforcement, how to carry responsibility without collapsing under it. These are ongoing processes. They unfold slowly, unevenly, across cultures and generations. They produce conflict, debate, error, and growth. None of this suggests failure. It suggests inheritance being worked through rather than resolved. The Anunnaki, if they ever existed as described, do not need to be destroyed, worshipped, or denied for this inheritance to matter. Their role in the story serves as a mirror, a way to think about authority, dependence, and growth without naming them directly. In that sense, the story has always been about humanity, not about gods falling, but about humans rising quietly into responsibility without realizing it had happened. Not about conquest, but about continuity. Not about blame, but about consequence. The broken throne does not accuse, it observes. And as the day fades and thought slows, the realization does not need to resolve into certainty. It does not need to produce answers. It can simply exist as context, as background understanding. Humanity did not inherit power in a single moment. It inherited process, decision, accountability, silence. What it does with that inheritance continues, quietly, every day. And that thought, settled gently, does not conclude the story. It simply rests within it, present, unannounced, shaping what follows without demanding to be named.